Hello, everyone. We're going to get started in a minute. So give me 1 minute or two, and then we will get going. Hello. Welcome back for another session of Talmud Tales. 22nd session, to be exact. Many of these. Wow. Pretty incredible. Okay. So this week we are going to look at an interesting story that I titled Exposure because it has to do with a part of someone's body being exposed, but it's also on a deeper level about different types of exposure. So we're gonna look at that. We're gonna look at the relationship between the various characters. We'll get into that in a minute. And of course, just a little bit of Zoom protocol review. At the bottom of your screen, you have the chat function, you have the Q&A function, and you have the ability to raise your hand. So after we go through and we look at the story together and I offer some thoughts, then of course, as always, I'll open it up for you to share your own thoughts or feedback or questions, and we'll take it from there. Okay? So we'll begin with the prayer for engaging in the study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher krishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Praised are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, who commands us to engage in the study of Torah. So thank you for being with me today. As I said, we're looking at a story that is about exposure. And what I want you to be thinking about as we go through and study the story today is there are a variety of characters. There are three main characters, and then there's one character who's actually not there in person but is referred to. He's someone who's passed away but still has a presence in the story. So really four main characters of the story. There are a variety of relationships that are taking place and being addressed in this short story. We have the relationship between the main character Homa and her husband, who is no longer alive. We have the relationship between Homa and Rava, who is the judge, who she interacts with during this story, and then we have the relationship between Rava and his wife, and I guess actually then we have the relationship between Rava's wife and Homa. Okay, so those are a variety. Maybe there's one more. We'll see if as we go through it. But those are the main relationships. I want you to be thinking about what are the guiding principles of each of these relationships. What can we intuit from the story, since not everything is laid out, and there's a little bit of background that I'll fill in for you. And then what is this, as always, what is this story trying to teach us? What I think here you see two relationships between two married people, and one seems to be vastly different than the other. So what are the differences and what are these relationships supposed to be teaching us? We also have the relationship here between Rava and his study partner, who is no longer alive, who is Homa's husband. So that kind of lingers under the surface throughout this story as well. Okay, so we have the relationships between lovers. We have a relationship between Chabruta partners, which was a very intimate, significant relationship for rabbis at the time, and still anyone who studies something with someone else in detail, there is an intimacy. There is a deep relationship that occurs through that. So we'll explore that a little too. So I want you to be thinking about all these things and what are we supposed to learn from them. Okay. This is not really related, but I just have to say it was really, I guess, because there are some real feminine and female-centric themes that come out in this story, and it was pretty wonderful for me to sit and watch some of the speeches last night at the Democratic Convention with my daughters, and for them to see some of these strong female leaders taking center stage, using their voices. Very, very powerful. So I hope you have had a chance to watch those speeches, or if not, I hope you take the time. As we all know, this is a critical time. So, okay, back to the story. Here we go. We're gonna look at the story. I'll read through it once, then we'll go back. I'll share some thoughts. and then we'll open it up to all of you. All right, so here we go. That always happens. Jeez. Let me try one more time. Sorry about that. Okay. This is from Ketubot 65a, section that tends to deal with marriage, but I'll give a little bit of background after we read through it once. Choma, the wife of Abaye, came before Rava. She said to him, "Rule on my alimony." So he did. She said, "Rule on the wine due to me." He said to her, "I know Nachmani," that was the nickname for Abaye, "he wouldn't serve you wine." She said to him, "I swear, my lord, he used to serve me wine in a goblet," or another translation, cups, "this big." When she demonstrated what she meant by lifting her arm became exposed, and a great light fell upon the courtroom. Rava stood up and went home. He demanded sex from his wife, the daughter of Rav Chisda. Afterward, the daughter of Rav Chisda said to him, "Who is in the courtroom today?" He said to her, "Choma, the wife of Abaye." She, Rava's wife, went after her, Choma, sorry about that, and beat her with the lock of a chest until she was driven out of Machoza, the town. She, Rava's wife, said to her, Choma, "You killed 3 men and now you've come to kill another?" End of story. Okay? Really short and sweet, but jam-packed with all kinds of things. Okay? So again, we have Choma, the main character, the woman who was married to Abaye. Abaye is now dead, and now she's going before the court to ask for alimony, to ask for some payments. And in this case, the payment is specifically about wine and her wine allotment, that she should be given some money so that she can have wine. And then we have Rava, who is the judge and also the rabbi, and he clearly has a relationship with Abaye, who's now dead, because he even calls him by his nickname, an intimate nickname, and they were actually Chavruta study partners, so we have that relationship. Then we have Rava going home to be with his wife, whose only name is the daughter of Rav Chisda, and he has relations with her, and then we see a little bit of her exchange with her husband. And then we have the relationship, though pretty one-sided and not much of a relationship, between Choma and the daughter of Rav Chisda, Rava's wife. Okay, those are all the characters that we have. So a little bit of background. We're studying in the section of Ketubot, but that section covers a lot of things. And specifically, if you were to look at this page in the Talmud, before this are a variety of stories that deal with wine and the challenge of giving wine to women. There's one passage before this that talks about 1 cup's okay, but as soon as you get to 2 cups, then it's going to get a little crazy. 3 cups of wine, that's your limit. After that, it's dangerous. Something along those lines. That's a brief summary. So this is a section that's dealing with wine specifically, and a few stories about wine and people, specifically women, going and asking for money for wine after their husbands die. So in one sense, this is supposed to be a story about the challenges of providing wine for women. However, clearly, it's not really just about wine. It's much deeper than that. So that's just a little bit of context so you understand. But really, we're looking at relationships here, right? And Ketubot is about, Ketubah, if you think about it, is about relationships. So I want us now to go back through it and really think about what are we supposed to be learning about relationships. And I think there's a contrast, as I said at the very beginning, between Choma and her husband, and it was her 3rd husband, and then Rava and his wife. Okay, so now we're going to go back through it, and then we'll open it up. Okay. Choma, the wife of Abaye, came before Rava. So Choma, just so you know, there in the Hebrew, there's an allusion to Cham, this idea of hot, built into her name, and the name Choma is not very common in the Talmud. So we have this sense of heat, or you could imagine passion, built into the name of this woman. She is the wife of Abaye, who came before Rava, and as I said, Rava and Abaye were Chavruta partners. Now, we studied, I don't know what session it was, the story of Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan, and their relationship, and how there was this man who was a gladiator, and then the rabbi comes and transforms him into a study partner, and it's a whole story about the the intimacy of the chavruta partnership and that relationship between two people who study together. And if we think about it, and it's not limited, I think, in our lives to just people who study together. Though I have to say, if you've had some kind of study partner, maybe it was in a graduate school, maybe it's through Jewish learning, whatever context, it could even be in a work setting where you have a partner with whom you work very closely. There is an intimacy that comes with that. You start to understand people on a deeper level. You can have the mind meld where you start to think the same way, or you can understand and predict what someone is going to say or how they're going to act before they do it, right? There are all these things that happen when you spend a lot of time with someone. Even if you're not married to them or sexually attracted to them, there does become an intimacy where you start to understand a deeper level of who this person is. And so that is what chavruta is supposed to be and what it represents in our tradition. And that is why we spend so much time in our tradition focusing on the fact that you're not supposed to study Torah alone. You are supposed to do it in chavruta, in partnership, because our intimate relationships are not supposed to be limited purely to the bedroom and purely to the people with whom we live and who we're married to, but really intimacy is something that is supposed to be practiced and understood throughout our lives and in the variety of relationships we have. Not all of them, but that by learning together, by questioning one another, by engaging deeply in discussion and debate, which is another theme that we've talked about at length before in our classes, this idea of debate and the centrality of debate in our tradition, that there is a real intimacy there. So already in this first line, we have a woman who is passionate or has heat built into her name. We have Abaye and Rava, who also have this intimate relationship. So we're setting up almost a triangle, so to speak. We're setting up the two most intimate relationships that existed in the Jewish world, between a husband and wife and between study partners. And all of them are being laid out in this first line so that we understand the complexity of what we're about to get into. Okay? So she said to him, "Rule on my alimony." So he did. So background is, Homa Abaye has died. This was his third wife. No, this was her third husband, and now he's died, and now she is due to be supported by the community now that she's a widow, and so she goes to the court in order to find out how much money she can have, and it's based on how she lived before. And she said, "Rule on the wine due to me," right? So here we go, and this is the link, of course, to the other stories that come before it in this Talmudic passage about wine and the relationship between wine and women. And he said to her, "I know Nachmani." Again, this was a nickname for Abaye, so already clearly right here we have the idea that Rava and Abaye knew each other very well, and actually they are a very well-known chavruta study group partnership throughout the Talmud, and they're referred to a lot. There is even one thing I found that they're sometimes referred to, the Talmud itself is sometimes referred to as a conversation between Rava and Abaye. So they're central figures here, and they're a model chavruta partnership. He wouldn't serve you wine. So now we have the first challenge that comes about between husband and wife and work partners, study partners. We have here the wife saying, "Well, actually, there was, he would give me wine, so I would like to be paid so I can have some wine." And him saying, "No, I knew this guy. I knew him, and the way I knew him, he wouldn't serve you wine." So him trying to establish his authority and the fact that he had a type of relationship with Abaye that gave him insight into Abaye's life in a way that maybe Choma, who was his wife, didn't. But she then comes back and says, "I swear, my lord, he used to serve me wine in a goblet this big," or another translation, cups this big. Okay, so right now we're having this idea that not only is she now countering and saying that, actually, no, he did serve me wine. You thought you knew everything about my husband, but actually you don't. One lesson that I think is being taught here is that on one level, of course, no matter who it is, even the people with whom we live, there are pieces of that person that we don't know and that we will potentially never know. And that's not a bad thing. That is just the way of the world and the way of the human condition, that each of us holds within us certain mysteries that are, or certain things that we decide to keep to ourselves one way or the other, that are not shared with even the people with whom we are closest. And that this is a recognition of that. On another level, it's also recognition that there are certain things that happen between a husband and a wife or in an intimate partnership that don't necessarily get shared with other people. That there is a difference between these types of relationships. As intimate as the Chavruta partnership is, as intimate as you can be with someone outside of whom you are committed to by marriage, that there is something that comes with marriage, that comes with a partnership that is so intimate or that reveals certain things about people's characters that don't necessarily get revealed to the rest of the world. And I'm sure we can think about those people, right? And sometimes it's positive things that are held and just held for a couple. And sometimes those are negative things that when we are surprised to learn negative habits or bad acting by one party or the other, or abuse of any kind, we then are reminded of this theme, right? That there are certain things that happen behind closed doors. We're all in our closed doors right now. We are all deep in privacy at the moment. There are certain things that are happening in our homes that the outside world is not aware of and potentially will never be aware of. Right. And so here there's a recognition that that happens. But also then she's saying, he served me in a wine goblet or cups this big. Now, we can just imagine, well, why would she do this, right? Is this just a dramatic way of using her hands to display something? Or based on the next line, is this a way that her provocative nature or her heat is not just for passion of speech, but that there's a deeper passion that the story is referring to when it comes to this woman? That if it says cups that are this big, you can imagine that a woman saying cups this big has certain allusions and certain visions that come to mind, or a wine goblet this big, that there are some physical actions, I'm trying to kind of skirt around it, but you know what I mean. Certain things and certain ways in which she acted that were potentially leading Rava to think of different things than just a wine cup or a wine goblet or cups, right? So when she demonstrated this, when she used these movements, whatever they were, when she lifted her arm, part of her arm became exposed, right? So she was covered, and all of a sudden, there's a piece of this woman that is exposed, and a great light fell upon the courtroom. Now, let's go back to what the courtroom represents. If you think about the courtroom, and this week's Torah portion, by the way, I'm teaching about the Torah portion tomorrow at 12 o'clock for our weekly Torah study. This Torah portion, Shoftim, is all about justice. It has the famous line, justice, justice you shall pursue, tzedek, tzedek tirdof. It lists a whole variety of laws about judgment and how we are supposed to ensure justice in our society. And so the courtroom is a place where we take the chaos of the world and we try to create some structure to that chaos, right? We try and tame some of the wild nature that exists in the human condition and exists in the world, and put it into a system that can be controlled and that is fair and brings about justice. So here we have in this courtroom, we have Choma, based on her name, and now we can see based a little bit on her actions. There is a wild nature to her, or what she represents, that comes into the courtroom, and Rava is attempting to potentially frame that or structure that or control that. And what we have here is the fact that there is something about this woman, and I would assume that the rabbis are also suggesting that there's something about women in general that cannot be tamed. No matter what kind of courtroom, no matter how powerful the person is who is trying to manage that and tame that it's not possible to do. And maybe that's, by the way, why I was thinking about last night before we started getting into this. I think that's one of the connections I'm making between the speeches from last night from these strong women and this passage, which is suggesting there is a power that cannot be tamed within women, right? There is something extremely in a positive power that when it is brought out, there is a light that can shine forth, and not a negative light, right? It's a light here that seems to suggest positive connotations, because if you think about the role of light in our tradition, Moses coming down from the mountain with light around him, there's a spiritual and mystical element of light in our tradition, and it's a powerful symbol, and it's not a negative symbol. All right, so there's something about her exposing herself. When a woman is really able to expose who she is in one way or another, there is something very significant and enlightening about that in a way that we don't really find with men in the same way. So I read this as potentially as a way you can see this in a positive way of how our tradition is suggesting that women play a central role in bringing and illuminating certain things in the world that men cannot illuminate on their own. So she comes out, and this there's this light, and what does it lead to? It leads to Rava standing up and going home. Right? There's almost an overwhelming power that comes from this experience. Now, it's a mix, as we're going to see, of all types of tension that may be building up within him. It's not just spiritual, because as we see, he gets home, and the first thing he does is he demands sex from his wife, who is known as the daughter of Rav Chisda. And afterwards, the daughter of Rav Chisda said to him, "Who was in the courtroom today?" Okay, so we'll pause there. He demanded sex from her. Why is it that he goes home? Is this a power trip? Is this a way in which a man who feels emasculated attempts to find a way to find power by dominating someone else? Is this the fact that there is an intimacy that comes from this woman who is able to be herself or expose a piece of herself, and that this is a warning almost that you need to be aware that when that power is released, that it can do all kinds of things to men and make them think all kinds of things. Now, not all of this is PC, obviously, right? But these are all the different ways we could be reading what's going on here. Another interesting thing here is that Choma had a name. Her name was Choma, but we don't actually know the name of Rava's wife. She's only known as the daughter of Rav Chisda. Already now what we're having is a division in how women are identified. We have Choma, who is a model of someone who is named, who is passionate, who exposes a piece of who she is, and by doing so illuminates the world, or at least illuminates the courtroom, illuminates the place of justice. And then we have, in contrast, we have Rava's wife, who has no name. She's only known as the daughter of someone else. So her identity is squashed in a way, or her identity is connected to someone else, and in this case is connected to her father, a man, and therefore she is not someone who has been able to kind of come out and reveal herself. So we have that contrast that's being presented here. And afterwards, the daughter of Rav Chisda says, "So who was in the courtroom today?" A few ways we could read this. One, she's just doing some pillow talk afterwards and wants to know, what was his day like? Oh, who was in the courtroom today? Or we could read this in the way I think it comes out, especially because of the way that Rava just kind of leaves the courtroom, goes home and demands sex, is that she seems to be suggesting, well, what led you to want to act this way, to come home and just want to have sex and be intimate with me? What was going on today at work? And what she finds out is he said to her, Choma, the wife of Abaye. Now remember, Rava's wife knows that Abaye was Rava's chavruta partner, that they spent hours and hours. They probably spent more time together than Rava did with his wife. Right? Imagine, the phrase, which I don't like, but, oh, so-and-so is my work wife or my work husband, right? The idea that we live in a society now where we almost embrace the idea that someone with whom we work has such an intimate relationship that we might define them as a husband or wife. But in the reality of our work life today, not necessarily in pandemic times, but in general, the amount of time people spend with the people with whom they work is much more time than what they spend potentially with their own family members. So we know that what's being revealed here is that now she's starting to understand that he was in the courtroom with the wife of his study partner. And she also knows some history about this woman, Homa. Homa, who this was her third husband, right? And that's a lot of husbands to go through. And also, yet, so we can imagine if she's had three husbands that she's not the youngest woman to be married. We could imagine she's a little bit more mature. Now, granted, you know, people didn't live as long as they live today, but no matter what, this is a testament that even someone who is a little older in age can still bring out that light and that intimacy and have that sexual attraction, that it's not just someone who is a virgin or newly married or young. I like to see that built in here. We're getting a sense that that passion of Homa potentially comes from the fact that she has been around for a while, she's had some relationships, and that it's through that she is able to reveal who she is, and that also still there is a sexual attraction and a power. That power doesn't diminish over time. If anything, that power seems to get stronger and stronger over time. So now we have Homa pitted against the daughter of Rav Chisda, as she's called, Rava's wife. And so now, what is her response? No, she could have responded, "Oh, that's nice. What a lovely family," or, "Oh, I know you were so close to Abaye," whatever could have happened. Instead, how does she respond? She, Rava's wife, went after Homa and beat her with the lock of a chest until she was driven out of the town. Okay? Kind of went crazy, right? And so why does she do this? Is this a demonstration of the society saying, no, that is dangerous to have women whose illumination becomes clear and visible to everyone, because that is not good. That is a power that can be destructive to the system as it stands. Is this the fact that this is a sign of jealousy and insecurity? That the fact that there was a woman who was able to do something and was able to kind of instill within Rava a sense of passion that maybe his wife wasn't able to instill, that this made her insecure about her own capabilities? There are a lot of different ways we can imagine this. But regardless, she goes after this woman and drives her out of town, which I don't think is necessarily what a positive lesson that the story is supposed to be teaching us. And then she says to her, the Rava's wife says to Homa, "You killed three men and now you've come to kill another?" In other words, three of your husbands have now died, and now what? You've come to kill another. You want to destroy another life. You want to destroy something else, and that's where the story ends. Okay, so what we have here is a striking kind of challenge between these two women, both of whom are powerful in very different ways. One who uses literally the physicality of the lock of a chest, right? And there's probably some symbolism there. She could use anything, right? You could imagine there are many things she could use to try and beat this woman with. But the fact is, she tries to beat her, and then she does so with a lock, right? What does it mean? Is that about the fact that there are certain things that we are supposed to lock up and keep to ourselves? Is that the lesson? Or is the lesson that what's problematic with Rav Chisda, the daughter of Rav Chisda, in other words, Rava's wife, is the fact that she has felt locked up. And that when people feel locked up, and now we could expand it beyond gender, when we expand it to the idea that there is an illumination within every single person, and when you feel as though your light cannot shine in the world, and you feel as though you are locked up, that's when you, number one, potentially act in ways that are destructive not only to yourself but to other people. But that here is the symbol, the symbol of a lock to show that this is what happens when you don't allow your illumination to shine, when you don't find a way to speak your voice or to counter the power dynamics that suggest to you, no, actually, I knew your husband better than you did, which of course is not true. But there are a lot of things out there in our world that say to us, no, you don't know better. I know better than you, even though that may be a person who is not in our shoes, who is not in our home, who is not in our circumstance. And instead of using empathy, they try and tell us, no, you're wrong, I'm right, even though I have no idea what you're experiencing in your own life. right? We know that that exists out there, and that is destructive and problematic, and that there's a power trip that comes from people who try to speak that way, right? Maybe this is kind of hitting Rava a little and saying Rava did this the wrong way, right? Because instead of him accepting this, he was overwhelmed by someone who was willing to stand up for themselves. And so he had to go home and try and exert his power. And the result of him exerting his power in the intimacy of his own home led to more destructive acts than if he had handled things differently. Right. So there are a lot of different things going on here. And this is, of course, why I love these texts. You can relate them purely into the context of the history in which they were written, in which case we're going to read this a different way than what I prefer to do, which is to try and figure out how can we shift the story, even if it's not necessarily true to the historic nature of the society at the time. You know, if we're not trying to relate this to our lives today, then we're missing something. So for me, this is really about illumination. This is really about exposure of oneself and who one is to the world. Okay, I think that's what I got for now. So let's open it up to all of you and see if you have any thoughts or questions or comments. I see Phyllis asks, how is Rava portrayed elsewhere? Good question. Most of the time, from what I recall, and I would probably have to do a deeper dive into looking for all the places that Rava is mentioned. Most of the time, it's a positive leader position. It's not necessarily in a negative light. But I would have to do more research, or you could do some research, Phyllis or anyone else, and go look for Rava and look at his bio, and also see if you can find other stories. But that's a good question. I'm sorry I don't have a full answer for you. But he is well respected, and he's not seen as a negative character throughout the Talmud. Okay, couple of people. Yes, Susan. Hi, Susan. Susan, you want to talk?
Yes, I fell out of Zoom. Several things. This reminds me too of Muted Passions, which you did session 9, but in the
Okay.
where there was a prostitute in the town, and remember that one?
Yep.
And he got the rabbi all excited, and actually bad things happened. So some of this is like exposure. Now, you mentioned it positively, but I think there's also negative aspects to women's exposing themselves, for which they need to take some degree of responsibility. So I think but you're saying it's a spiritual life. To me, it seemed also like a sexual light, like this Muted Passions one that came when he saw her body. Instead of making a date with Homa, Rava goes home to his wife. Now, I don't like the fact that he demanded the things, but he channeled his sexual urges in an appropriate way there. And then Rava's wife, he castigated her, but if there is a woman who sexually disrupts a marriage, then the wife can feel anger towards this woman, also anger to her husband. And then the lock of a chest, I thought of it as the old fertility, the chastity belts.
Nice. Oh, great. Thank you, Susan. Yeah, great. Yes, I would say you can read this also, that maybe what she was doing in that courtroom was trying to use her sexuality to take control of the situation or to manipulate the situation. So yes, you could read it negatively, and yes, he does go home and channel his sexual needs to his wife as opposed to going after her. There's a reference, I forgot to mention this, in another part of the Talmud that there is a euphemism of a cup of wine or a cup of drink to sexuality, right? Which is built in even then earlier in the story. And there's one passage, what was it, that says, "One may not drink from one cup and think of another," right? That's from Nidarim, the section Nidarim, right? One may drink from one cup but not think of another. In other words, be focused on who you are intimate with and not be thinking about someone else. So there is a lot of sexual undertones that are built into this. So thank you for your comments. Yes, as always, Susan. Thank you. Hey, Jeff.
Hello, Rabbi. Couple of things. Number one, the story to me exposes two elements: that Rabba, our judge, is easily perverted and is really relatively poor in controlling his urges, and is not adequate in his role either as judge or as someone who abides by self-control. So he is shown as an extremely weak character to me. The
Okay.
other element of this is this can be translated to present day in stating, maybe facetiously, that the road to wealth for women in America is paved by death and divorce. And it seems like her manipulations and her body usage and exposure and lack of modesty was an endeavor to improve her alimonial lot, as she references early in the story. So it's
Okay.
shows very little grace on the part of us as males and judges, so to speak, if we're that easily perverted to leave our post, leave and do things which are hedonistic, so to speak.
Okay. Great. Thank you, Jeff. Phyllis. Hi, Phyllis.
A couple things. Um, First, it didn't seem like people had.
All right, can you speak up a little, Phyllis? It's a little hard to understand you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
So there doesn't seem to be any empathy for her as a widow. And it seems to me that the two couples had very different relationships. And one was much freer and respectful of the each other as opposed to Bravo's. And it seems to me his wife was um, pretty rude. Um, so I'm losing my train of thought.
Yeah. Oh, that's okay. Thank you, Phil. What I heard from you was there seems to be a lack of empathy for Homa, and that there's a contrast between the two couples, between Homa and her husband Abaye, and the free nature of their relationship, right? Even built into the idea that he would serve her wine, given what we would have read if we were reading the whole page of the Talmud, was something that brought out the libido, and brought out the sexual nature. That this was a relationship where sexuality was embraced, that she's even hinting at that even before she shows her arm, and whether she does that on purpose or not, right? Before there is an overt sign of sexuality built into the fact that she said, no, actually, he used to serve me wine. Like we had a romantic side to our relationship that people didn't know about, versus the kind of relationship that existed between Rava and his wife, which seems to be more, as Jeff referred to, this idea of the hedonistic, more demanding approach, as also Susan said, right? This idea that a power trip, right? We don't get that same kind of feel from the way that the relationship was described between Homa and her husband, right? So we do have this contrast that may be trying to teach us about the types of relationships we're supposed to have and the role of sexuality, behind closed doors, or the way in which we engage in that intimacy with one another. Great, thank you, Phyllis. Okay, Claudia. Hi, Claudia.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
I love how sexuality is right front and center in the story, from a text that's it's a holy text. And I think something that I guess we have to remember is it's in a book that was aimed at men. So one thing you can look at is to say, well, sexuality is okay as long as it's channeled within the proper channels. Go home to your wife and demand sex of her. But what strikes me is that there are so many assumptions that can be made about these stories because so much is not said. And one of the assumptions that came up is that Homa, used the man that she was married to, and here she is, maybe doing it again with a fourth man. And it's probably a reflection of society in those days, but I think about it, it hasn't changed that much in 1,000 years. But I have a question. They put the word like sex. He goes home and asks for sex. What is the word for sex in Hebrew? Is that as open and as direct as the English one?
No, usually not. Usually there's a euphemism used to suggest, or like to know one's wife, or he went after he demanded, and the daughter said afterwards. So some of this is that there's certain things that are either Aramaic or Hebrew words that are allusions to the act, that the reader who spends time with it recognizes that this is what they're doing. So it's usually not as straightforward as they had sex. Yeah. All right. Thank you, Claudia. Okay. Let's see. Abby. Hi, Abby.
Oh, hi. Well, I'm looking at Homa. I don't really like Homa. I feel like she's the kind of person who's very manipulative and uses sex or whatever to get what she wants. She's saying she wanted, she wants wine that's due to her, things due to her. And I feel that the wife represents sort of, morality, and she's willing to fight for it. So I find that Homa is sort of the villain, and the Rava's wife that went after her just didn't take it. She was going to fight for that wasn't right. Like she shouldn't be taking advantage of people, whether it's sexual or whatever, but just in general. So that's how I see the story of
Okay.
the wife fighting for, I don't know, morality or whatever is, not for people not taking advantage of you, where the husband was weak and got taken advantage of too. And the only strong one, I feel, was the wife.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, see, and I think I'm glad you brought this up, Abby, because I think this goes to the challenge that women face have been facing for a long time, which is it's really tough. You can either be seen as a heroine or a villain. And there's so many things that come into that. Is sexuality a sign of positive strength? Is it a sign of an attempt to undermine strength in others? There are all these things that are so tied up into the female experience. And of course, I can't speak to the female experience, but from my pure outside view of someone who has always been an advocate for women's voices and women's roles, and even looking at, if we look at the political system and we look at the role of women in politics and the challenges that come with that in a different way than men have to deal with. It's just, I think even built into a story like this, we have so many different ways in which we can see the female characters, and I feel as though there seems to be more complexity when it comes to the female characters and how we can feel about them, positively or negatively, than exist as much for the male characters. Yes, you're right. This goes to show again how we see the strength of the woman in her ability, as Abby just mentioned, in Rava's wife, in her ability to use literally physical power to push away those who threaten her, or is it the power of Choma, who brings it in a different way? But is that also laden with negative connotations as well? So all kinds of things here. Steve, hi, Steve.
Hi. So I'm concerned that Rava's wife did not use her energy to make a point with her husband, because her husband, I think, exposed himself by his weakness in needing to rush home and demand sex in order to feel powerful again, instead of having the grounding to resist whatever temptation was put in front of him. So I think sometimes, even today, we find women blaming other women rather than putting the blame on the weakness of the male.
Okay, so you're suggesting that it was Rava's weakness here, and that his wife also failed by not calling him out on his weakness and instead just going after the other woman?
Correct. Yes, I
Got it.
think
Okay.
that Rava himself has some lessons to learn.
Great. Thank you. Okay. Jeff, well, let's see. Jeff and then Susan, we'll wrap it back around to the two people who started the discussion, and then we'll probably be concluding. Go ahead, Jeff.
I wanted to present it in a slightly different way. It has to do with the ability of women to understand each other and be both suspicious and aware of other women's motivations. And the anger, the beating that she submitted to Hama, is due to her awareness of the deceit, treachery, and tricks this other woman was noted for, so to speak. That's why she asked, who did you see? How did you get turned around, come home, leave court, want to have sex? Who stimulated you? Who was there? Then, as her mind deduced the mechanisms of women and how they work to achieve their ends, it became obvious to Rava's wife that something needed to be done, because she was well aware of the tricks of the trade, so to speak, of women who use physicality to gain power.
Do you think those tricks of the trade, so to speak, are also an issue for men? Or are you suggesting that only women need to understand other women in a certain way because they use techniques that men don't use? Or are you suggesting that if this story was presented in a way where there are two men who act in various ways, that it's also a statement about how men need to know how men work?
I think women are so much more sensitive to social cues than men are. Unless there's a threat posed or some kind of important financial or survival instinct, men's minds don't work on the basis of feelings, emotions, know by history what these things can lead to. The mind of women is the keeper of all emotions in society, and they are eminently aware of all of these positive and negative cues that women use to achieve their ends. Men are straightforward. They're mostly stupid and reactive instead of proactive, which I have to use as a word to describe women. Women are
Okay.
much more proactive in their thoughts and in their actions than men are. Look at his response. He got stimulated, he left the court and ran home. Purely
Right.
reactive and brainless almost, just
All right.
controlled by his animal instincts, so to speak.
Great.
Women
Thank
are
you,
in a
Jeff.
much higher plane, emotionally and socially, than most men are.
All right. Thank you. Susan, you have the last word.
Yeah, I thank you, Jeff. I certainly agree with that. You know, men are very easily stimulated. I mean, her bare arm. I mean, and we exposed part of her arm from her sleeve. And women are attuned to these other sexual cues. I agree with that. Now, the Talmud gets a bad rap for treating women poorly, and yes, they may in several instances. But the three of the stories that we read, men in relationship to women, show how poorly they're doing. The mixed passions one that you did in the Talmud tales, his wife had to adorn herself as a prostitute. Speaking of direct stimulation, in order for him to have sex with her. And then the returning home, those two stories that we did last week, where they left their families and they did, being away for 13 years, they didn't have sex with their wives. And elsewhere in the Talmud, it talks about how you're supposed to satisfy your wife depending on your job. If you're away as a I believe as a seaman or a traveling salesman, not for those guys. And this one too, I thought his wife, and I agree with Abbe, that Homa was the more of the seductress and using her sex, and the wife wanted to maintain her marriage and not have this hussy ruin it.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all. As always, I love the variety of perspectives. This is why I love doing this every week and why these stories are so incredible and why it's so important that we have the space where, in a productive, respectful way, we can bring all these different perspectives together. So, thinking about the DNC and how we're in a time that's going to be even a more heightened time in the next couple months where we are starting to think about our own country and the different ways in which we can understand the world around us. I hope that the model that we have created here in this group can be something that you can also use in the discussions about all kinds of other things that you may be talking about with people in the months to come. But thank you. And no doubt in the future we will continue to have stories that continue to address sexuality, gender. Those are things that are common themes throughout the Talmud, and so this is definitely not the last time. And as Susan pointed out, a better memory than I even have in terms of which stories we've already covered and when we've done them. And as she alluded to, you can go back and look at all of those stories again, and you can start to compare and contrast and see how they are different and similar to one another. So thank you again for joining me. An early Shabbat Shalom, and early also starting tonight, we have Rosh Chodesh Elul. So we're getting very close to the high holidays. We are in the month of Elul. Just so you're aware, for Wilshire Boulevard Temple, our daily emails, if you get them. If you don't, you can definitely sign up for them. Our daily emails are going to start to have a daily teaching from one of our clergy members for every day of the month of Elul, starting tomorrow, every 7 days a week between now and Rosh Hashanah. And each one ends with a call of the shofar, a little tekiah blast, since there is a tradition that you are supposed to hear the shofar every day, except technically on Shabbat. But you will have this opportunity just to get little tastes of teachings related to the month of Elul and related to the high holidays as we start to approach those. So I hope you, starting the Shabbat, can also do some of your own preparatory work to start preparing yourself spiritually, emotionally, relationally for the high holidays. And since we won't be joining together in person, start thinking about how do you need to make amends? How do you start to need to do the work that is important to you to make sure that you're entering the new year and so that it can be one of health and goodness. So thank you again. Look forward to learning with you next week. And again, Shabbat Shalom.